Sara squeezed her eyes shut, willing the creak of footsteps down the hall outside her apartment door to fade away. She'd been on edge all evening, possessed by an inexplicable sense of impending danger. Just as the phantom noises ceased, a sharp rap at the door made her jump. Steeling herself, she peered through the peephole and stifled a gasp. Jared stood there, fist still raised to knock again. His eyes flickered back and forth, burning with an unsettling intensity, even through the warped lens. Sara held her breath, hoping he would assume she wasn't home and leave. But he knocked once more, louder this time, the vibration carrying through the solid wood. "Sara, I know you're in there," Jared called out, his voice barely containing a snarl of frustration. "Open up. We need to talk." Her mind raced through potential escape routes as she pressed herself against the door, as if she could melt through it and disappear. The balcony was too high to jump from without serious risk of injury. Her phone was in the other room. If she ran to grab it, he might break the door down before she could call 911. She was trapped with no choice but to face him, hoping her words alone could end this nightmare. Twisting the deadbolt open with a shaky hand, Sara pulled the door open a crack and peered out with wide eyes. "There's nothing left to say, Jared. Please leave." Her tone was steely with attempted confidence, but Jared wasn't fooled. His nostrils flared at the suggestion of being dismissed. "Don't give me that," he spat, shoving against the door with his shoulder until Sara had no choice but to let him barge inside or be crushed. She backed away slowly as he prowled further into the living room, hands clenched into trembling fists at his sides. Every fiber of her screamed to run, but escaping wouldn't solve the root issue. She needed to make Jared understand once and for all that his obsession ended here. "We had one date, Jared," Sara stated, proud of how calm her voice sounded despite churning panic. "I'm not interested in pursuing anything further. You need to accept that and move on with your life." His eyes flashed dangerously at her words, lip curling in a sneer. "Is that what you think this is about? One stupid date? I thought we had a connection, Sara. But then you had to go and throw it all away over one little argument." Jared stepped closer, and Sara retreated 2 paces back until she collided with the wall. Her mind flashed to their confrontation in the alley outside the gym last week, his fingers bruising her arms as he screamed in her face, spittle flying for rejecting his slobbery kiss. She'd managed to knee him between the legs and flee, but the memory of his wrath still sent chills down her spine. This was a man capable of real violence. "I said no means no," Sara replied, hating the tremor in her voice, but keeping eye contact steady. "My answer isn't going to change, no matter how many times you show up here uninvited. Now leave before I call the police." For a beat, the threat seemed to work. Jared blinked and took a step back, raising his hands in a mocking placation. But then his face twisted in on itself, mouth stretching impossibly wide in a wordless howl of rage that curdled Sara's blood. In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between them, fist striking out with bone, cracking force. Sara twisted at the last moment, the blow glancing off her cheek instead of shattering her nose. Pain exploded across her face, but she ignored it, dropping into a low crouch and launching herself at Jared with every ounce of her strength. They crashed to the floor in a whirlwind of flailing limbs. Sara clawed and scratched like a wildcat, going for the eyes as she'd been trained in her self-defense class. Through the haziness of adrenaline, a single realization cut through. She was fighting for her life. Chapter 2. Red Flags Appear. Sara winced as the antiseptic stung her numerous cuts and scrapes. She'd cleaned and dressed her wounds as best she could after escaping from Jared the night before. But the events still replayed on an endless loop in her mind. No matter how hard she scrubbed, she couldn't wash away the memory of his hands closing around her throat or the mad light in his eyes as he squeezed. She'd fought him off through sheer primal instinct, gouging his face hard enough to make him howl and roll away, clutching at bleeding eye sockets, In those precious seconds, Sara scrabbled to her feet and bolted for the door, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock it behind her. By some miracle, she made it to her car unscathed and sped off into the night, Jared's enraged screams still echoing down the empty street. Now, dawn light streamed through the blinds as Sara finished patching herself up. Deep purple bruises looped her neck like a gruesome necklace, a permanent reminder of what could have been her fate had she not escaped with her life. She was supposed to meet her friend Amanda for coffee this morning to distract from her trauma. But how could she possibly explain these injuries without reliving the assault all over again? A knock at the door jolted Sara from her grim thoughts. Amanda must have shown up early. "Steel yourself," she told her reflection before going to answer, remembering what the self-defense instructor always said about owning one's story. Survivors don't have to hide or feel ashamed. But it wasn't Amanda waiting in the hallway. Jared stood there, face a nightmare canvas of scratches, still weeping trails of blood down his cheeks. His expression warped from false concern to a feral snarl at the sight of Sara's battered neck. "Please, we need to talk," he said, attempting a placating tone at odds with his murderous eyes. "What happened last night? I didn't mean to hurt you like that. You know how I get when you push me too far." Sara slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, hyperventilating. She knew this wasn't over. Jared had made it clear he wouldn't stop until he'd broken her completely. Grabbing her phone with slippery hands, she dialed Amanda in tears. "Hey, Sar, what's up? I'm almost there for coffee," Amanda said cheerfully before registering Sara's panicked gasps. "What happened? Are you okay?" Between shaking breaths, Sara managed to choke out the truth of Jared's assault and his return just now. Amanda assured her the police were on the way right away before comfortingly instructing Sara to breathe slowly and arm herself with whatever was handy, just in case. The next few hours passed in a blur as officers took Sara's statements and examined her injuries. An emergency protective order was issued against Jared with his photograph distributed to all local patrols. But Sara knew it may not be enough. Jared seemed beyond reasoning and had proven he wouldn't hesitate to escalate his attacks. Over the next few weeks, strange things began occurring that drove Sara's anxiety to a fever pitch. One morning, her tires were all slashed outside her building. Another night, creepy, stalkerish phone calls piped through with heavy breathing, but no words spoken. She started jumping at every shadow and noise, wondering if Jared was hiding just out of sight, waiting to strike again. Then one evening, Amanda spotted an all-too-familiar figure loitering outside the gym where Sara used to train. She snapped a covert photo of Jared glaring up at Sara's apartment windows before speeding off into traffic. It was the final confirmation Sara needed. He was monitoring her every move, perhaps even breaking in when she wasn't home. The locks and cameras her landlord installed offered little comfort against such a cunning stalker. In a desperate move, Sara changed her number, moved to a new apartment across town, and scrubbed all identifying details from social media. She lived in a state of hypervigilance, constantly looking over her shoulder as she walked alone at night. But no matter how well she hid, Jared's obsession refused to dissipate. One afternoon after work, Sara emerged from the subway station to find all 4 tires on her car slashed beyond repair. Scrawled across the driver's side door in dripping red paint were the words, "You're mine." Sara dissolved into hysterical sobs, realizing too late that no place would ever feel truly safe again as long as Jared was still out there in the shadows, hungering to possess her completely. Chapter 3. Fighting Back. Sara winced as footsteps echoed down the alley behind her, quickening into a jog. She cursed herself for not calling an Uber, instead foolishly believing she could handle the late-night walk home after a stressful day at the office. Now, alone in the dark urban maze, any shadow could hide a threat. Gripping her keys between clenched fingers like claws, Sara picked up her pace without outright running. The last thing she wanted was to appear prey fleeing a predator. A sick feeling told her who pursued without looking. She'd been right to fear Jared had somehow tracked her down once more. Sure enough, his grating laugh carried down the alley as he closed the distance between them. "Come on, Sara. Don't be like that. I just want to talk. Can't we put the past behind us? I miss you, baby." She shuddered at the slimy affection dripping from his voice, gathering her resolve. No amount of pleading or terrorizing would make her his victim again. Rounding the next corner, Sara spotted the glowing exit sign of a 24/7 dealie up ahead, and sprinted as if her life depended on it. Bursting through the door, she spotted the bored-looking teen cashier and gasped, "He's after me. Please call 911. Just then, Jared crashed through as well, skidding to a halt at the sight of potential witnesses. His normally composed mask slipped, revealing a feral monster hiding just below the surface. The clerk alerted the owner, who emerged with a baseball bat while dialing emergency services. Jared glowered but made no move to flee, as if daring them to lay a hand on him. His rage felt radioactive, poisoning the very air. Sara collapsed against the counter, sobbing with relief, but knowing this was far from over. Jared's eyes bored into her, promising future retribution. After that close call, Sara lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. She carried pepper spray at all times, changed routines, and drove anxiety, inducing escape routes to work that added an hour to her commute. Still, the stalking continued. Endless nuisance calls on her office line, locks glued shut so she couldn't leave at night. Sara felt like a mouse, toying with a demented cat who relished her terror. Her boss, noticing her obvious distress, agreed to flexible hours so she rarely walked alone. Several more unnerving encounters followed, each ratcheting up Jared's unhinged behavior. He left ominous notes under her windshield wiper, sneaked into her building while maintenance worked on the system, jumped out at her from alleyways, hoping to catch her off guard for just a moment. Her friends began staying overnight to keep vigil, taking shifts so Sara was never alone. But Jared found ways to penetrate even these defenses, threatening messages appearing like clockwork, claiming he knew their every move. Sara struggled to maintain routine as her fear consumed more of each day. She lost weight from stress and jumped at small sounds, constantly peering over her shoulder, no matter where she went. Her friends urged going farther into hiding, but Sara refused to let Jared chase her from yet another life she'd worked to build. She needed to take a stand, once and for all, before his stalking madness destroyed her completely. A plan began formulating in Sara's overwrought mind. If she lured Jared somewhere isolated under false pretenses of reconciling, she could get a clear recording stating his intent and threats, the evidence she'd been denied for so long due to lack of physical harm. Finally, the police would be forced to see him as the dangerous predator he was, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. It was a bold, risky move, but living under Jared's shadow had become worse than any death she could imagine. It was time to take back control. Consequences be damned. All she needed was the perfect opportunity. One frigid night, waiting alone for a train, that chance arose. Loud footsteps crunched on newly fallen snow behind her isolated platform. Sara spun calmly to face Jared, who emerged with a twisted grin as if he'd been summoned. "Fancy meeting you here, baby. What do you say we get out of the cold and talk?" His toxic pleas blended with the howling wind as Sara steeled her nerves. The endgame was set. Now she just had to survive long enough to see it through. Chapter 4. Confronting her stalker. Sara shivered uncontrollably as she waited in the shadows of the condemned office building. Jared's final chilling words echoing in her mind. The trap was laid, now all that remained was to spring it at exactly the right moment. She'd feigned acceptance of meeting him alone, using every last acting skill to hide the terror constantly threatening to consume her. Jared had grinned wolfishly, immediately sensing her growing weakness under his constant pressure campaigns. Soon, he promised, you'll forget all about resisting me. We belong together, Sara, whether you see that yet or not. At the appointed hour, Sara sent the pre-written decoy text, hinting she was ready to reconcile. If only he'd listen without anger first. Jared fell for the bait immediately, enthused GPS directions arriving within seconds, as expected. Now his car idled somewhere close by, her phone recorder prepped to capture his inevitable, uncontrolled outburst as planned. Deep down, Sara knew confronting Jared directly was a gamble with her life on the line. But it had come to this, living constantly under siege, or taking her chances with a decisive end, whatever the cost. She'd survived thus far through blind luck and support alone. This endgame required active courage. Few could claim facing down a merciless stalker so deep in madness. Footsteps approached as expected, echoing eerily off crumbling concrete. Sara edged along the wall, finding her hiding place behind a support beam. She slowed her rapid breathing with calming mantras, adrenaline sharpening her senses. This would be over soon, one way or another. Jared's shape materialized out of the darkness, wary confusion twisting his brow. Sara, are you in here, baby? I came just like you asked. His footsteps drew nearer, zeroing in on her location, unawares as Sara forced herself to remain stone still. I knew you'd come around eventually, Jared murmured, almost to himself. No one understands us, the way we understand each other. He rounded the column, freezing at the sight of Sara, glaring back defiantly. For a beat, they simply stared. Predator facing prey turned hunter at long last. Then Jared's face rippled into a mask of such demonic rage, Sara almost faltered, her last resolve wavering under its savage intensity. You tricked me, he growled, low and lethal as an oncoming landslide. Sara held up her phone with a shaking hand, thumb hovering over the stop button. It ends tonight, Jared, she answered, voice stronger than she felt. Your threats and stalking are over. Confess to me clearly on video what you've done, and I'll let the authorities handle you from there. A humorless chuckle escaped him as Jared slowly advanced, causing Sara to retreat step by step. Do you really think after all this time, I'd just roll over and make it that easy? You're smarter than that, baby. Now, put the phone down before someone gets hurt. His threat shattered the last of Sara's illusions, replacing fear with cold wrath. This monster would never stop coming. The only safety lay in eliminating the threat once and for all, by any means necessary. No, you've had enough chances, Jared, she spat. It's over now. Sara lunged sideways just as he sprang, darting around a pillar. They twisted and struggled, her nails raking whatever skin she could find as Jared overpowered her through brute strength alone. Her phone skittered away, the ominous chuckle of her recorder capturing every grunt and snarl of the brutal fight for Sara's life. Somehow, she wrenched free long enough to spot the glint of a discarded pipe, grabbing it up just as Jared's hands closed around her throat once more. With the last ounces of her strength, Sara swung the pipe with a wordless battle cry. It connected with a sickening crunch, Jared's grip going lax as he crumpled to the floor. She collapsed, gasping, barely able to confirm his prone form sprawled unmoving. Only then did the magnitude of what she'd done begin to sink in through the adrenaline fog. Sara crawled weakly to her phone, ending the damning recording with a bloody thumbprint. Her hands fumbled through blurred vision to call 911 on autopilot. Please, help. I think I killed him. Jared, he was stalking me, tried to. Oh, God, hurry. Dizzy and nauseous, Sara slumped against the scuffed wall, watching Jared's chest for any signs of life through tears. It was over. For better or worse, his shadow would haunt her no more. She'd reclaimed her freedom by any means necessary, as the final cost demanded.